feel like I'm stuck in an emergency that never ends. For years, decades really, but who hasn't? I'm fighting that feeling too. I mean, any gay man in my age cohort, those of us who are left, has experienced so much of this. Over the years, I lost 2 partners. Whenever I say that, Lady Bracknell comes to mind. You know, that moment in Act 1 when she says, "To lose one parent, Mr. Worthing, may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness." No? Too cold-blooded? You don't rely on bitter sarcasm to get through. Well, now you know something important about me. These losses occurred years ago, decades. But that seems not to make a bit of difference. Okay, organizing this is a problem. Proximate or historical? Proximate. My second partner was named Joe, my husband really, though this was before equal marriage rights had been legislated. But we were very self-authorizing. We had a big ceremony and a party in the upstairs social room, Central Presbyterian on Park. And that was because our caterers worked out of that kitchen, really. He was supposed to take care of me. Joe was HIV negative. I've been positive since, well, at least since 1982, even though that was before the virus was isolated and there wasn't a test for it. Hell, there wasn't even a name for it. But it would have been impossible for me not to have picked it up by then. I met Joe in a support group. I joined it a couple of months after my partner Mason died. It was the one group I could find that worked with my patient schedule. It was a kind of combination caregiver bereavement group. It turns out our partners died within about 6 weeks of each other. Joe lost Christopher around Christmas. I don't think it was at all unusual back then for a pair of grieving men to couple off together. Back before the protease inhibitors, everyone was hip deep in death back then. But even before they arrived, it was possible for me to believe for long periods of time that I wasn't going to get sick. We didn't start dating till after I left the group. The group, it stopped being helpful to me. After being with patients, it was hard to be with the suffering of more people after work. It was summer by this time. I had ruled out the idea of having a relationship with an HIV-negative man, but Joe was certain he wanted it. Me. He would say to me more than once that he was certain I was going to outlive him. Turns out he was right. Joe died in his sleep. It was a stupid accident involving prescription cough medicine with hydrocodone in it in conjunction with his severe sleep apnea. The doctor speculated that the hydrocodone suppressed his body's reflex so much that when the apnea stopped his breathing, his body couldn't rouse itself enough. Joe developed a nasty cough, and the doctor prescribed the strongest cough medicine he could. A friend of Joe's, who was also a patient of this doctor, told me that he was worried, the doctor, that I would sue him for prescribing Joe a narcotic. Rico, this friend, told me the doctor was going to come to the memorial service, but I don't think he did, at least as far as I know. How could he think as if I did? Anyway, it was a super effective cough medicine. It worked. Joe stopped coughing. He liked it so much that he drank the whole bottle in about 6 hours. He was extremely stoned when I got home from work that night. I'd never seen Joe stoned before. Neither of us drank or used drugs at all. Joe had been clean and sober for years, rehab, the whole thing. He developed a heroin problem when he was an actor in LA. He'd been on a sitcom and had felt the jolt of excitement when he was one of the boys everyone was looking at. That was a very fleeting moment. Then no one was looking. was supposed to take care of me when the jig would finally be up, when I would get sick. At least, that's how I thought about it when I did. Joe seemed so solid. He projected stability, and I responded to that. 2 months after we started dating, he moved in. 10 years later, he was dead. Joe snored badly. I'd never heard snoring like that. It was Three Stooges loud, ridiculous, really. After years of frustration over this, he did a sleep study, and he was diagnosed with sleep apnea. His was very bad. He got a CPAP machine, which of course he hated and wouldn't use consistently. I don't think they were as user-friendly back then as they are now, at least so I gather. Once that we tried to sleep together, I didn't get any sleep at all. I couldn't even sleep when he moved to the couch in the living room. His snoring was so comically loud. But Joe was determined that we sleep together. It disappointed him terribly that we couldn't. That I'm a very poor sleeper in the best of conditions didn't help. He was heroic, really. He underwent 2 surgeries to trim the soft tissue in his throat. After one of them, he even attended a performance of Così fan tutte at the Met because the tickets were my Valentine's Day present. I bought them before the surgery was scheduled. He sat through the whole performance. Can you imagine? He would do anything to make it possible for us to sleep together, and nothing worked. Eventually, we found a workable compromise. We put a twin bed in the little room I'd used as an office before Joe moved in. We'd spend time in the big bed together until Joe fell asleep, and then I'd move to my bed in the small room, and I'd wake up early and crawl into bed with him in the morning. This worked. We slept. We had plenty of time together in bed, which was really good. We enjoyed each other a great deal. When I slept, I enjoyed things a lot more. Well, I got home at 8:30, and I found Joe on the toilet. So stoned, he didn't care that apparently he'd been there for some time. The bottle of cough medicine was in the bathroom wastebasket. It was empty. I tried to help get Joe into bed, but he refused. He said he was fine, he just needed to be left alone. I tried to get him to stand up, to at least pull his pants up, but he resisted. He was so stoned. He did that hovering, long, drawn-out, junky crouch. I don't suppose you've ever had occasion to see that up close. Out on the street, perhaps, in the bad old days. Yes, well, the stoned person drops down so slowly, they seem never to touch the ground and never to stop moving. I've never been so close to someone in that condition, certainly not in my home. I've seen junkies in that posture many times, but I wondered if I should call someone, but I didn't know what I would say, that I was frightened. And what could anyone say to me? What kind of intervention could anyone make? And all he needed was to sleep it off. I mean, I guessed that. That's what I told myself. So I left him in the bathroom, and I went into my room to read. And I checked on him again in about an hour, and he seemed a little more alert, and this encouraged me. I wasn't so afraid. So I decided I would check on him hourly. Each time I did, he was a little better. He was coming out of it. He could form a sentence. He told me to leave him the fuck alone. The last time I checked was at midnight. I just finished reading American Pastoral by Philip Roth. I helped get Joe into bed. I had a full day of patients the next day. I had to get some sleep. I thought everything was okay. I got up at 5:45 to piss, and I was going to crawl into bed with him. That was our routine. He was quiet. He looked comfortable, stretched out on his back, the covers kicked out of the way. His mouth had settled into a sweet half-smile. And I bent down to stroke his chest, and he was cold. And I realized that that odd bluish color he had wasn't because of the slant of the early morning light through the slats of the horizontal blinds. It was because he was dead. Okay, history, brief. I'm a 67-year-old gay man who's lived in Manhattan for 49 years. I'm also an analyst, in practice over 30 years. I was 26. I think I was 26 when AIDS first started showing up. That was the summer I was seeing the most handsome man I'd ever met. We met at the baths. Later that summer, Paul was part of the group that started GMHC. His lover was one of the first men to get sick. Since Paul was fucking me vigorously, it was easy, once it was obvious that an infectious agent transmitted sexually was the cause of these illnesses, to assume that I'd probably picked up whatever it was. All this happened in my first analysis. I seem to want to tell you all about it, to tell it all again. I wasn't surprised to learn I was HIV positive. I've been lucky. I mean, anyone would say that. The first T-cell test showed that I had very few T4 cells left. If that test had been given in later years, I would have gotten a diagnosis of clinical AIDS. But we weren't there yet in the AIDS story. I've always been able to tolerate any of the medications the doctor prescribed. Never any problem with side effects. Well, none that prevented me from taking the meds. I never got one of the opportunistic infections that caused the deaths of nearly everyone I knew back then. Then, in the summer of 1991, I met Mason. I was in analytic training. Mason was short, compact. I liked the way I could hold him so thoroughly. Mason liked it too. Mason was a writer. He had this sort of enchanted boy look. He was a guest at the summer house I shared with a bunch of friends out at Fire Island. He was from North Carolina, the Piedmont, and he had this accent that drizzled charm like honey on a slice of cornbread. The day after we first met, we were huddled together in the string hammock I got for the house at LL Bean, working the Sunday crossword. And when he knew what a ha-ha was, that clinched it for me. I knew I was in love. No? You don't get the ha-ha reference? Jane Austen mentions them in her novels. That's why I looked it up. It's a trench dug around a field where sheep are grazing to keep them from wandering off. These details are tangential, obsessive. I seem to want to beat you to the punch, which raises the question, why ought I to be punched? To which the response is, isn't it obvious? I'm alive, and Mason, and who knows how many of those I've known and loved are dead. So, 3 months after Mason and I decided we were a couple, the first Kaposi sarcoma lesion appeared on his back. He lived 2 more years as the Kaposi's spread around his torso and down his thighs. A choking strand of poisonous flowers feeding on him. Toward the end, I would change the dressings twice a day. He stood in the bathtub, and I would pull away the old dressing, and chunks of his thigh would fall away each time. I'd rub ointment into the raw place and wrap his leg up with fresh gauze. One time, he looked down at me and said, "This is the way we make love now, isn't it?" We lived in this very large apartment a few blocks from my office that I could almost afford. I found it after Mason could no longer manage the stairs at my place, and he really couldn't handle his own. We'd been living together at my place anyway. It was really good to get this big place. We were really lucky. We turned one of the bedrooms into Mason's day room, where he could write, watch videos, and the refrigerator from his old apartment was there to keep the medications that required it cool. It was the perfect appliance for the modern gay couple at that particular moment, a dedicated refrigerator for the pharmaceuticals. There were times I hated Mason. I also loved him. Baldly, ceaselessly, hopelessly, precisely without hope. And yet, I couldn't conceive of his death. We had this odd mutual understanding. We knew he was going to die, probably soon. And yet it felt like our lives would remain exactly as they were, forever. We'd get up together, read the paper over coffee together. I'd go to the office in the morning, then come home to Mason for lunch if he wasn't out at one of the innumerable doctor's appointments. I'd go to the gym and then to the office. Mason qualified for the God's Love We Deliver meals, and we'd share one of those when he was unable to eat and I'd cook. And we'd sit in Mason's room on the couch, holding hands, watching TV. One day, when I came home for lunch, Mason said he had a favor to ask of me, and I said, of course, I'd do anything. And he asked if I could find a way to buy him a gun if things got worse. A gun! I got very good at the medical technology. There was usually a medication that had to be pumped into Mason, and the pump was very tricky and urgent, always so urgent that I got it to work right. And I mastered maintaining the ports that were installed in Mason's body, first in his arm, then in his chest, the Hickman catheter. And this required strict sterile technique. I became obsessed with strict sterile technique. But this was finally an action I could actually take that would reliably keep bad things from getting in. Mason's body changed vividly. He'd get all bloated from the steroids that were given to reduce swelling. It oddly made his whole torso swell. Then emaciated from the chemotherapy that did nothing to prevent the insatiable feeding of the capaces. I don't think I've ever known anyone's body so intimately. Mason needed adult diapers when he could no longer control his sphincter. Sometimes he was ashamed, sometimes he could be playful, tearful and playful. But here was another task I could actually perform. A task with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A task that could be performed correctly. I could make Mason's body clean of piss and shit. And then I could make him dry and powdered and comfortable, and we'd have perhaps 20 minutes of comfort until the next task. One night on TV, there was a broadcast from the Met of Falstaff. I looked forward to this particularly. It had been a long time since we'd been able to go to the theater. Mason wasn't feeling well, so he was lying on our bed as the opera approached that. It's a kind of apotheosis, isn't it? That final scene. I heard Mason get up and move as quickly as he could, which wasn't terribly quickly. I heard him cry out in anguish, practically howling, and I raced down to the bathroom. He was standing at the toilet, and there was a trail of shit across the rug, and he was sobbing. It was like a reflex by this time. There were rolls of paper towels and sponges ready to hand. But this time, I was aware of that transporting part of the opera, the part that always left me feeling grateful for what human beings could do. And I went into the bathroom to get Mason cleaned up, which wasn't easy, because the port in his chest couldn't get wet. I washed my hands and rinsed off his body, what was left of his butt, his thighs, when I got the dressings off, working carefully, always afraid of infection. He held onto my shoulders as I worked, and he kept saying he was sorry. I could hear the opera spinning out in the other room as I was cleaning up Mason's accident, mopping up shit. Spray product and scrub, bend down to sniff to make sure the smell wouldn't linger. I worked quickly but thoroughly. And I was aware of how angry I felt. It was terrible to feel so angry, but I was missing the end of the opera. It was the one thing I looked forward to that day, that week, and I missed it. I just kept repeating, sweetheart, it's okay. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I know, sweetheart, just let's get you clean again. Dabbing carefully, peeling away tape, rinsing off shit, mopping up the floor, wrapping up his legs again, putting a dry, fresh diaper on, kissing him, holding him carefully, making a joke, finding a way to laugh. It's 30 years ago. He died 3 months later. His doctor told me that Mason's was the worst case of Kaposi's he'd ever seen. This was saying a lot.